All right. Welcome on this super rainy morning. So we're going to be talking today about the equal access rule and also, and probably more importantly, the new BOS LGBTQIA policy, or policies, I should say. My name is Abby Miller. I use she or they pronouns. We are going to talk about that today. If you all could just chat in the name that you go by and what your pronouns are, that'll help us all get comfortable with that right off the bat. And Liz is going to be here with us as well.
Good morning. Nice to see everybody.
Thanks for kicking it off, Sarah. Okay, so let's get started. All right, we're going to do 4 things today. We're going to understand the terms that are within that larger umbrella of what can look like alphabet soup of LGBTQIA+, learn about HUD's equal access rule as well as BOS policies, and then hopefully spend a fair amount of time on the practices and policies that really create safe and inclusive projects. I really feel like I always have to start this type of training with this adorable face right here. This is George. George is a trans kid who came out, and actually, Liz, if you hit one more time, the link will come up. So George came out as a boy a few years ago, and he and his mom have this fantastic video talking about him coming out. And I think one of my favorite lines from this tiny truth teller is, well, when I came out as a boy, people thought I needed to be all masculine, but I'm very sparkly. And I think that I'm going to talk throughout about the Gen Zers and how they are pushing all of us to grapple with new identities and new ways of looking at things. And I think it is a plus for all of us that we have this generation of folks who has given us this opportunity to discover new things about ourselves and about the world and other people. So LGBTQIA+ protections are necessary for these kids, and they are also necessary for the adults who show up in our shelters. So if we can go to the next slide, I want to start with talking about what discrimination looks like in our systems. We have coordinated entry access points and shelter staff who are doing things that aren't really making a lot of sense, and they're setting it up that people have to go back to the streets to feel safe. So first example, coordinated entry staff tells a single dad, shelters, well, we have a family shelter, but that doesn't take men. I know that BOS has a policy that this is not allowed, and so it may not be an issue. It may not be an issue in Connecticut. But what is on paper and what actually happens are 2 different things, as we all know. So this is a big one. The second, shelter employee learns that a potential client is a trans woman and says, oh, well, you could come here, but only if you've had the surgery. Spoiler alert, there are many surgeries that somebody could have. There is no one and done sort of surgery. And also people who transition, it is a social transition. It does not need to be a medical transition in order to bring oneself into alignment with their gender identity.
Oh, wow. Daughter's moving to Canada.
If you are unmuted, you might. Thanks. The third, coordinated entry employee picks up the phone, or it's an in-person appointment, ignores a potential client saying, their gender identity, enters a different gender into the system, and directs that person to an inappropriate placement. If it's by phone, they might use the person's voice or voice. If it's in person, they might say, you look like this, so I'm going to put you over here. And the last is just an outright refusal. No, we cannot have you here because you might make people uncomfortable. Or I have heard anecdotes that people are uncomfortable. On the other end of things, there's the housing placement. There are housing projects and facilities that are ignoring complaints from LGBTQIA+ folks for all sorts of reasons. This is one example, harassment by other residents. Also not respecting confidentiality in the name of, well, I think somebody else needs to know this information. And so somebody's transgender status is told to other people without a purpose and without a clear disclosure, without telling the person before they disclose this. There's no need for this information to be shared, and yet it is still shared. There is something of a, because it's different, I need to tell people feeling about it. And then the last is at housing enrollment, caseworker requires a lesbian identified individual to follow special procedures or forces the person into an inappropriate placement for any of the reasons that I've talked about in these other examples. She might make people uncomfortable, or you know, we really think this is a place for families and we don't know if you should be here, all of those. So I'm gonna pull up a poll and launch it before we do this video, and just see, what have you seen in your project of these types of issues? They haven't come up ever, they've come up, we have not handled them well, they've come up and we've handled them really well. All right, we've had, okay, more people are getting in the swing of the participation now. Thank you. Okay, I'm gonna end the poll and show the results. So 1, the issues haven't come up. 2, they haven't been handled well. Most feel you're handling the issues well when they come up. That is fantastic, that we have a majority that they're handled well. For those that the issues have not been handled well and the issues that haven't come up ever, I would encourage you to be participatory in this and chat in questions that you have. That is infinitely more interesting than listening to me, you know, go on and on. But if you have specific questions, even specific examples without any names, of course, being involved, share those in the chat and we'll get to them. All right. So I am going to have Liz start this video in 1 second. This is by True Colors United. I'm sure you all know they focus specifically on LGBTQ homelessness among youth. And I think this is a delightful video showing some of the delineations between gender identity, expression, and sexual orientation. Liz, I think you have to unmute for us to hear it.
Gender expression.
There we
They are
go.
all different. We think of each existing on a spectrum. Being on a spectrum means that there are more than just 2 ways to be. There's a whole range of ways to be. Sexual orientation describes an individual's emotional and/or physical attraction to another person or people. Gender identity refers to a person's innate identification as a man, woman, neither, both, or some other gender. A person's gender may or may not correspond to the sex assigned to them at birth. While gender identity is someone's understanding of their own gender, gender expression refers to the way that a person communicates their gender to the world. It includes all of the external characteristics and behaviors that are socially defined as either masculine or feminine, such as dress, grooming, mannerisms, speech patterns, and social interactions. Social or cultural norms can vary widely, and some characteristics that may be accepted as masculine, feminine, or neutral in one culture may be assessed differently in another. It is important to note that someone's gender expression may or may not align with traditional perceptions of gender identity. Again, gender is a spectrum. It's important to remember that there are more than just two ways to be.
All right. I'm going to launch this next poll. I just want to get a sense of how familiar folks are with this language. If majority of people are very familiar, then I'm going to skip over the next few slides, and you'll have them in your materials, but we won't spend our time on it. That is most people. I'm going to end it and share. Okay, so majority of folks, these are very familiar terms. This is probably becoming part of your everyday vernacular. That is fantastic, because 5 years ago, the last time I did these trainings, it was not that. And I think that's a great sign that we are moving in a direction where more full inclusion is possible. For those who don't use them regularly or they are new terms, towards the end of the presentation, I have a slide that has just maybe like 8 different links to things. It's not too overwhelming, but it starts to sketch out some of the major terms and explain, and some of the terms that may be a little bit newer to us that have started to be used a lot more. Things like pansexual, non-binary, gender fluid. For instance, I identify as gender fluid. So things like that. And I think, Liz, then let's move through these slides and just start on the slide that says equal access rule. Okay. All right. So HUD's equal access rule. I had the incredible opportunity to work on this while I worked at HUD, and feel very personally attached, I suppose. Very meaningful work. So HUD's equal access rule, the first one came out in 2012, and it said really simply equal access. It's that second bullet there. Equal access is provided in all HUD assisted programs, regardless of sexual orientation, marital status, or gender identity. Obviously, regardless of gender identity does not work in the context of sex segregated facilities. And so HUD knew that they needed to come back and further articulate the policy for sex segregated facilities. So that's what I got to work on. And we put out the amended equal access rule in 2016. And what we said there were these last 4. Fairly straightforward. You have to place and serve individuals according to their self-reported gender identity. Self-reported meaning the gender identity that that person tells you, not with any guesses or assumptions or anything on your part. And even more importantly, without asking further intrusive questions or requiring proof of gender identity. So back to some of the forms of discrimination, that is, asking for, well, have you had the surgery? Where's your birth certificate? Where's your driver's license that tells me that this is the gender that you are? We are going to talk more later about why that is so difficult, and some of the things that you can do to help in terms of documentation. And then the last 2 things, you have to update your policies and procedures to reflect that the above are happening in your program. And then when privacy concerns come up in the form of requests for reasonable accommodations, you have to take non-discriminatory steps. Mainly what that means is wait for a client to tell you that they want something different than other people, and then it's okay to consider it. And if you can, to allow for that accommodation. If you can't, okay. But the non-discriminatory part is essentially saying you program as a matter of course cannot say anybody who comes through our doors, if they are transgender or if they are non-binary, then we put them in this room over here, or we automatically give them a hotel motel voucher, or anything else that has the effect of isolating or segregating people based on their transgender status. Okay. And I saw a question come in the chat. Okay. I think I'm gonna take this one now, actually, and then I will start talking about the LGBTQIA+ policies for BOS. So somebody is asking a person where they are in their transition acceptable. If so, or if not, maybe, are there other ways to ask without the person feeling judged or looked down upon? So I will talk about this again later, but I'll say now, this is really about needing the information. And if you need it, then you ask it. If you don't need it, there's no need to ask. And I think that with things that are new to people, and so let's just assume that you are going to have some staff or you are not particularly familiar with transgender folks or with non-binary folks, or queer, lesbian, gay, bisexual, pansexual, across the board. I think that there's a tendency when confronted with something new to want to ask questions of the person who represents that new thing. And I think all of us, when we're in those situations, have to stop and ask, am I asking this for my own benefit? Or am I asking this because I am going to do something different to serve this person better? Or do I need this information for required data collection? And if it falls into, I'm going to do something different and better for this person, then great. If it's not, then no. So I think maybe asking rather than where somebody is in their transition, because transition is also a bit of it can be a false concept. I think as non-binary and more gender spectrum identities have come up where somebody doesn't identify as singularly male or female, that transition, I think, looks for a lot of us in our minds, it's, oh, male to female, female to male. But what about the in-between space? Transition looks a lot more gray to an observer in that way. And so a way to ask would be, do you have gender affirming healthcare? Is it important to you to have certain gender affirming services while you're here? Things like that are not targeting that person's identity or where they are in their own journey, but what they need and what you can provide. And that was probably a really good example for a lot of these policies. So let's go through these. The first, modeling appropriate and affirming behavior. Essentially, if you read the long form of this, that means if you have personal bias or negative feelings about the existence of trans folks, the existence of gay, lesbian, bisexual folks in your programs, that you can't let that come out in the workplace. You or staff cannot let that out in the workplace. Regardless of personal opinion, that there are respectful services that are provided. The second is what we just talked about, so I will not belabor that point. Ask for the information you need. Maintain the confidentiality and privacy. There's no need to tell another staff person anything about somebody's personally identifying information unless there is a legitimate use for it. The fourth we have not talked about yet. Ask name, pronouns, and title. Title meaning Miss, Mr., Mrs., Mix, MX is a non-binary title that's used. Pronouns, he, him, she, her, they. Again, don't assume. The next, if you as a staff person see any harassment, bullying, violence, or other form of discrimination by staff, by your supervisor, by other clients, that you have to take immediate action. And what that means is making sure that the behavior ceases and documenting. And also, depending on who it is who's doing those things, if it's your supervisor, it's not easy to go to your supervisor and say, hey, you're doing this thing. But the agency needs to have a policy that helps staff and other clients see where they can go when they see any of these things happening. The next is really mirroring the equal access rule, place based on self-reported gender identity. And when somebody does not identify as singularly male or female, defer to the client for the decision on which placement makes the most sense. And we will get into that more in practice later. Make dress codes gender neutral. For instance, if you have a rule about showing midriffs or showing knees, I don't know, maybe you have those things. Instead of referring to women's skirts or men's shorts, just say, you know, whatever you wear, pants, skirts, whatever, has to be a certain length, or no exposed midriff. Everybody has a midriff. Okay, and then the last is starting to get into the practice. Connect residents with gender affirming healthcare providers whenever possible. And that is going to require you and your staff to do some work up front. And I have some links later in the presentation to get you started with that. All right. So what if somebody does not identify as male or female? I want to really walk through this because I think the way that this is framed for people tells them a lot about what they're going to experience in your facility. So if somebody comes, I will use myself. I am gender fluid. I use she, they pronouns, and I tell you that. You could do this in a very cut and dry way and say, oh, well, we serve women. Do you identify as a woman? Very confrontational feeling, like I'm not getting a sense that this is a place that understands or respects that non-binary genders are understood, any of that. Or you could say, listen, our project is set up in a binary way. We serve women. I understand that you do not hold this binary as your gender. And I think, you know, based on what we have available in the community, unfortunately, there are only binary based options. And so what I want to ask you about, and I can help you talk through it, is which gender-based placement is going to be the most appropriate for you. Think about your safety, think about your privacy. This is the setup of our rooms. Like, go through and help that person make a decision so that they don't feel that they're hanging out in the wind trying to make this big decision by themselves, and potentially it's just too much and the street is the better option. That's worst case scenario for us. All right. So this is a policy that you're probably all familiar with, but I put it in here anyway, because I think it always bears repeating. When projects serve any families with children, it means they serve all families with children. So any composition, as long as there is a minor child, a dependent under 18, that family is eligible for family services. That means multi-generational, single dads, single moms, same-sex couples, opposite-sex couples, kids with, families with older boys. And this is actually referenced both in the COC interim rule as well as the original 2012 equal access rule. So the 2012 equal access rule clarified family, what family means. And the COC interim rule disallows family separation for any reason. So BOS, this is also, I confess, I do not know which came first, but regardless, this is federal, state, and local, not okay. Okay. At this point on, it's really, we're going to talk a lot about practice. So I want to pause here and see if there are other regulatory or policy questions that have come up. I'm going to take a look in the chat and feel free to type it in there if you want. Margaret, we are going to talk about forms and gender and Casco. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. Really important point for those who cannot see the chat. LGBTQIA2S+ staff make a huge difference. And also we have to be aware of the burden that this has on the staff at the same time. That is well said. I am not seeing anybody else write into the chat, but please put whatever questions you have in there. We can get into nuance. Okay. So creating safe space in practice. Started to, go into what this actually looks like in talking about non-binary status and making decisions about where you stay. But that is at the moment of somebody showing up. And what I want to talk about here is stepping back, and not stepping back in an inactive way, but stepping back and saying, okay, am I prepared for trans women to walk through the door? Am I prepared for trans women who don't pass? What is passing? Essentially, it means, in whatever context you're using it, it means that a particular part of your identity is not visible to people, and that identity is usually one that's been stigmatized or discriminated against. So trans folks pass or don't pass, and that changes their experience of the world. Just like we all have a variety of identities that people may not be able to see. And so we're able to move through the world sort of in the norm, in the mainstream. And others are not, and that makes life much different and much harder. So knowing that you are going to have all manner of folks walking through your doors, what are you going to do to signal to them as soon as they come in, or as soon as they go to your website, that you're a safe space? I, again, took these from True Colors United. They do wonderful work. These are great posters to put up on the wall. Great poster or great snippets to have on your website, thinking about where clients are going to interact, with your program, what do you need to put there to let them know that they are safe? Okay. Now that's just the physical space. So there's also a social space that's made up of staff, other clients, the culture of the program, and going to talk through some elements of that. So the first is consider what your participant agreement says, if you have one. If you don't have one, consider adopting one. So this is actually from the network, LaRed. You can see the link here to get more of their materials. But this is presented to everyone who signs up for a program. And it's just saying really what that first BOS policy is, which is appropriate and affirming behavior, i.e., you may come in here with all sorts of personal bias. That's okay, we cannot change that. But what we can enforce and what we can expect is that you don't bring that to bear on your behavior with other clients. Same for staff. But I think, a lot of times the pushback that I've heard about, well, we don't want people, I don't know about trans women because we serve cisgender women and I think it makes them really uncomfortable. So the answer, if people are uncomfortable, is not to remove the offending object, right? It's to help people feel comfortable, all of the people. So this starts to get at that. And this is but one piece of it, but it's a good start. Second, somebody comes in and you have to ask them these questions. These are actually, so number 2 and number 4 on this list are not HMIS data standards, but 1 and 3 are. So legal name, you have to ask legal name for the data standards, for deduplication, for data quality, all sorts of reasons. But legal names, particularly for folks who have transitioned and are using a different name, that legal name can be associated with horrific pasts. Experiences of that name can be parents who refused to acknowledge a child's identity and used that person's legal name as a way to punish them, to emotionally torture, harass. So there's a lot of baggage with legal names. So thinking about how you practice when you have to ask this, always ask name you use and probably lead with that one. What name do you use? Okay. Is that the same as your legal name? Okay. I understand sometimes legal names can be a source of trauma and pain. So if that's the case for you, I will make you this promise. We will ask this one time, and we're going to put it into this system because we need to for legal reasons. But you never have to say it again, and you never have to hear it again. If you want to write it down rather than say it, you can do that, and I'll input it. All of those moves are showing somebody that you understand that this is a dicey area for them. Whether it's even dicey or not, actually taking the time to say, I understand that this could be, is helpful. Okay. One more thing actually on the names. This occasion of name you use and legal name, that is also back to the earlier comment of like, do I ask somebody about this particular element? This is a great one. If somebody is using a name and their legal name is a source of pain and re-traumatization, you can use this occasion to say, do you want help getting your documents updated? And that becomes, my goodness, you may be that person that really turns things for them. In that every other place they go may not be this sensitive. So once they have a document that says their name, great. Okay, that is it on names. Asking about gender. So these listings here are the current gender identity categories that are in HMIS. And what you can do with these is essentially select all that apply. So you can mix and match here, and you can let clients mix and match to get at something that is most close to their gender identity. Female, male, gender that is not singularly female or male, transgender, questioning, or nope, I am not telling you that. Or I don't know. So what if somebody says, I don't know? That is not the time to then guess about what you think or put in something just because you run a sex segregated facility and you know that it's going to be an issue if you haven't checked male on there. That is not the time to do that. If somebody says they don't know, truly put do not know. The other thing that this gender identity mix and match, select all that apply allows people to do is decide whether they want their transgender status to be in the official record. And that is their choice. So any of these are legitimate and possible, and explaining that to people, like you can pick any of these, and also you don't have to put this in here if you don't want to. All okay. Sorry, can you go back for a second, Liz? I wanted to touch on pronouns. Okay. What pronouns do you use? This is, thank you, Gen Zers. This is a grab bag these days. There are so many options. Like, I don't know if you've all seen ZZim. That was, gaining some traction a few years ago, but now people are using all sorts of pronouns. So if you serve young people, chances are they are serving up pronouns that maybe you've heard, maybe you haven't. So it's great to ask, because it doesn't even necessarily, somebody may not have their pronouns like matching their gender identity in a way that makes sense to you, but it makes sense to them. So asking is always the way to go. And you learn something every day. I've been learning about neo-pronouns. They're fascinating. All right, thanks, Liz. So we have not talked about sexual orientation much. And in some ways it's because it is much more straightforward. But in thinking about asking, what do we ask when? Sexual orientation, you may not need to ask. So HUD does not require it. PATH does not require it. RHI, Runaway and Homeless Youth, does, and I believe your YHDP projects do. You don't have to ask about it if it's not required. And again, I would go back to the same thing that I said earlier. Do you need the information? If you need it for something, if it is to direct or tailor services, if it's to hook somebody up with peer support group, whatever it is, if there's a reason to ask the question, then by all means ask the question. But think through, why do I want this information before you ask it? Given that a lot of this work, I would say the rubber hits the road in the sex segregated facilities, it's not just because they're sex segregated, it's also because they're congregate, which is a super hard way to live. And it brings up all kinds of issues that don't come up when you have a bedroom door to close and lock, or a separate unit in some way. So really, a lot of it comes down to shower and bathroom facilities. I will say a word about living arrangements as well, but these are the areas where some amount of undress is going to be necessary. So if there are pit showers, or just, open toilets, or, there's no doors on the stalls because of overdoses, like a lot of different reasons why you may have like a low privacy environment in the bathroom area. Chances are you will need to do some sort of privacy modifications or accommodations. I talk about these really as time space. You can change the space, or you can change the timing. Those are really your two options, as long as we're stuck in this mortal plane of, the time-space continuum. So you can do curtains, you can do locks, doors, partitions. It's really nice if you have a single-use restroom that anyone can use. Again, not setting facility policy that if you checked transgender, or, then you have to use the single-use facility. It's not that. It's if somebody requests to use it, you can make that accommodation if it makes sense. But then the last one is just timing. And all of this depends on the type of facility you're running, obviously, and how well you're staffed and what you can deal with and what you can't. There may be some accommodations that you cannot make. That is okay, as long as it's not motivated by discriminatory bias. But if you can stagger the shower times, or set aside, a few pockets throughout the day that somebody can have access to the shared restroom by themselves for 15 minutes, 20 minutes, that can go a long way. So addressing conflict, I'm going to talk about in the moment, but the first point I would make is, if you're proactive, that moment of conflict is going to go a lot better. So staff should, for any reason, for any conflict, staff should not be thinking about conflict resolution as the conflict is happening. That shouldn't be the first time that comes up. Being proactive is having a participant agreement, having publicly posted expectations of how clients treat each other, how staff treat clients and each other, and training staff in not only in conflict resolution, but in the various types of vulnerability that might lead folks to be targeted in a congregate facility. But then in the actual moment, do not target the cooperative one to make the change. That is going to send the message to everybody in that shelter that folks who are aggressive, folks who harass, that people get moved out of their way just that people get moved out of their way and they get to do what they've been doing. Everybody's watching. So you focus on the aggressor. Staff training, I have already talked about that. But the last one is, this cannot involve expulsion of the victim. I think some of the scenarios that I have heard are, we have a congregate facility, we have access to some motel vouchers, this person keeps getting harassed. Can we please just move them to a motel? Did that person ask you to move to a motel? If they didn't, then that is not the solution. Something else has to happen. Okay, we're gonna run through these, but I have a feeling that y'all are gonna knock these out pretty quickly. So I will give you a second to read this and give you a break from my voice, and then I'm gonna launch a poll. Only half have participated. Getting a little better. Those of you who haven't participated, please do so. We have 5 holdouts. I know, Liz, I'm forcing the issue here. All right, I'm gonna end the poll. Okay, yes, not only can you allow it, but you are required to do so. And this is back to that point of you do not expel somebody, either because you're worried about a potential issue or because an issue is coming up. That is not the remedy. All right. Thank goodness, these come up so slow. Do not isolate. You may request an accommodation, and the facility may accommodate if you can, but it's not so that a client has to accept that. There's going to be one more that comes up. Okay. All right. Next slide. Placement in facilities. I'll read this one out loud, just in case. I run a domestic violence project that serves women. We house residents in 2 separate buildings on the same property. All residents have access to the same services. I have decided to house transgender women in one building and cisgender women in the other building because I'm worried about triggering traumatic experiences for residents of the project as they begin to rebuild their lives. So can I require? Can I require some women to live in a different building, room, or project because of their transgender status? We'll share the results. No, my project has to serve all women in the same way. To separate folks into 2 buildings is isolating and segregating because of transgender status, and that is expressly prohibited. All right. And then this one, I'd really like you to chat. To type a response. So at my women's shelter, where everyone sleeps in a room with 3 roommates, a person is referred to the project by an outreach worker. When they arrive, the individual refuses to pick male or female and says they don't identify with either. What should I do? Let them know the status of the rooms at the facility and let them choose what's best for them. Yes, that is great, Sarah. Explain the program setup and offer to assist them in thinking it through. Ask them where they'd like to stay. Yes, yes, yes. Thank you. And I also want to address Casco's comment up here. I think it's a good idea to be proactive and go ahead and offer single-use bathroom access to everyone in advance, rather than make people have to ask to use a bathroom, thus potentially outing themselves. Yes. If your facility is set up in a way that you can do that you can offer that access, then by all means, that is a great option. Some facilities are not going to be able to do that and will have to base it on requests. But if that's an option, that's great. Okay. All right. So it seems like most of you are already well past begin, but for sake of everybody, does your agency have an anti-discrimination policy? From the equal access rule, you have to have policies and procedures that reflect that marital status, sexual orientation, and gender identity are not classes that you would discriminate against. Chances are you have an anti-discrimination policy as well. For other protected classes, you need to make sure that those three are represented and that those other elements of the equal access rule are reflected. And I think reading BOS's policy makes a lot of sense, adopting some of that language. Okay. I think this next one is just, yeah. Go to the next. And the next. I talked too fast without my bullets. Is it posted publicly? So are you telling people, back to this signage, public posting, are you telling people that there are protected classes and that those folks are not going to be discriminated against? Hopefully in plain language. And then the last one. Is everybody trained on the policy? How often? Are they trained right when they start? And notice that this is staff, volunteers, contractors. Do the security firm folks that you contract with, are they trained on this policy? Because who's going to be interacting with people right off the bat, right through the door? So everybody has to be trained on this. All right, so this is the slide that I promised to you all earlier in the presentation. If you want to read more about terminology, the first two are really good, like basic, cover all the bases. The third and the fourth are about non-binary status, so not singularly male or female, and the idea of dead naming, which is what I talked about with the legal name versus name you use. So what it's called in our community is dead naming, meaning I've made a firm cut with everything that was associated with that, and that name is now dead to me. So that'll help you think through, how to ask these things. There are some training materials here. The two in the middle are HUD. There are some staff training scenarios and then a guidebook. The top one is True Colors United training materials, and the bottom one is the Network LARED, who had that participant agreement. All of them give you put together, it's a great suite of materials. And then the last is just a really excellent list that GLAAD did about being a good trans ally. I think it's always helpful to read that. Right. If you can just click 2 more times, Liz, we'll just get these all up here. Okay, so in Connecticut, you have LGBTQ services. Here's your link. Maybe you know about this, maybe you don't. The second is Connecticut's Fair Housing Materials that shows you how to do an online complaint. There is also a number you can call. And then the last is something that the National Transgender Center for Equality, pardon me, I had to think that through, put together and keeps updated, is basically state by state, all of the state laws on name changes, also gender marker changes, if that's applicable. So you can go there and see exactly what is possible in Connecticut, how you need to do it. And then when the time comes for you to help somebody, you'll be prepared. Last thing, I think I always end on this in every training. Where can you file a complaint? This is 9 times out of 10 going to be clients who need this information, but staff may also need this information, or volunteers. Make this available, make this information available in your facility. As directors, as staff, as supervisors, you train, you put expectations in place, and then there is a moment when people act as they are going to act. And when those actions are discriminatory, people need a way to get a remedy. So you can use all of these. There's a federal, a state, and then a BOS specific. Thank you for participating. We are at 10:57. We could take some questions if folks have them. Any nuances that I didn't talk about that you'd like to hear about? Aha, Spooner House, okay. Regarding sexual orientation, I'm just going to read this comment out loud. Regarding sexual orientation, our agency does not need the information for providing services unless there's something specific the client identifies or requests. So we do not currently ask about it. However, how do we as a field begin to identify gaps, disparities, et cetera, and then address those and work towards equity for LGBTQIA folks without collecting the information? This is a great question, and one that I have struggled with for years and years, and there is no easy answer to this. I think at HUD, HUD is always thinking about what do we put in HMIS data standards and what do we not, and why do we need the information? Arguably, there is a case to be made that Congress needs to know the prevalence of lesbian, gay, bisexual, pansexual folks who are experiencing homelessness, because that creates a needs case. It also, you know, it helps a lot of things. I can say during my time at HUD, we did not make it required because we felt that if researchers are doing this work, that they can identify the prevalence, the disproportionality of queer folks in the homeless population, and that is where we can make our case, because this information is not really needed for everyday services in the homeless field and can be used in discriminatory ways. That's kind of our, that's what we came down with. But next year, I don't know, HUD may feel differently. I can't say we anymore. But it is a really complicated question. And I think as a community, you need to be talking about it. And absolutely, as a community could decide we want to collect this information, or as a facility, you could decide that. If you want to build out that an arm of services, or if you want to make a case to the community, any of that. Casco, any recommendations? I know we are right at 11. I am going to say how to offer single-use restrooms proactively is make it clear that it's not a stigmatized thing. There are all sorts of people who want to use a single-use restroom for really private reasons. So I think making it not stigmatized is the important thing. And the last, any guidance on updating the community name? I think I am going to come back on that one. I cannot answer that now, and it is already 11 o'clock, and I apologize that it's probably gonna be 11:01 in 2 seconds. Thank you so much. I will follow up on the SAIGE question.
Thanks.
Have a great rest of your day.
Take care.